again. Welcome back to Research and Information Skills. It's week 4. Today what I want to talk about is essentially, to me, the most important lecture that occurs in the whole cycle. That is evaluating information. The key question that I've appended to this is, how do I find information that is right for university? I want to begin the lecture by looking at some of the differences between, first of all, objective and subjective information, then move on to primary and secondary sources, and then finally go on to evaluating sources, which, as I say, is probably the most important thing that you do in research and information skills. It's a skill that you'll be using throughout your academic career, and as you get better at it and more efficient, what you'll find is that you can not only find sources quicker, but also evaluate them very quickly for use in your own work. Let's start off by looking at some of the differences between objective and subjective information. I have to confess outright that I have some issues around the notion of objectivity. I think we rarely are able to see things from an objective stance, i.e. that we don't bring some sort of baggage or some sort of perspective or even some sort of prejudice to the things that we do. Things don't happen in a vacuum, and I think, like in terms of our histories, in terms of experiences, we generally see things through a lens, no matter how wide that lens might be. But anyway, for argument's sake, on slide 3 I've tabulated the differences between objective and subjective. So, for instance, if we're looking at subjective, subject being you or me, and usually is singular in that sense, the essence of subjectivity essentially is what you think. So it's about your opinions, it's about your judgments and assumptions and beliefs, etc. The things that you bring to bear on a particular issue, a particular thing you're actually exploring. And I think all of us generally, and well, I suppose perhaps I'm speaking very widely here and generalising perhaps a little bit too wide, but for most part we bring opinions to bear on the things that we're examining. And that being the case, it's not always accurate. We don't know the full picture. We don't understand often all the complicating factors in an issue. And I guess to provide an example, perhaps if we're looking at something like the arrival of boat people from Indonesia who are coming from other countries, there's a whole range of views that are promulgated through the news and obviously on the internet, etc., that often has a very negative view of this particular activity. Some of the issues that we don't perhaps understand so well is why these people leave their countries. We may have a rudimentary understanding, but for me personally, having visited many of the countries that these people come from, I can understand why they leave. I'm not necessarily saying what they do is right. In fact, it's wrong in terms of international law, etc. However, if you have even a background understanding of why some of these people leave the places that they live, which I have to be honest here, is so alien to the way we live, particularly in the West, that having that sort of broader understanding or insight into the background of these people perhaps mitigates to some extent some of the negative projections, some of the negative judgments that we make about these people. As I say, I'm not condoning what they do, not in the least. What I am trying to say is that opinions and judgments based on often misinformation or small amounts of information is probably as dangerous as perhaps the people coming, in a sense, in terms of levels of prejudice and the reactions based on that prejudice. I think probably the important thing for me here, beyond such controversial issues, and I have to reiterate, I'm not condoning what boat people do, is that my own experience coming to university, I initially started university up in the University of New England. My experience was extremely positive there. But I remember in my first year suddenly realising that I had a whole, I guess, a range of assumptions, beliefs, judgments about things that very quickly fell out of step with the work that I was actually doing. You know, in other words, and at the time I was studying history, studies in religion, Islamic studies, and a whole range of other, and sociology, and I found very quickly that a lot of my judgments and a lot of my views were fairly poorly constructed and based on fairly tenuous evidence, and that was quite difficult to accept to begin with. I spent the best part of perhaps 6 months even resisting, I guess, the inroads that university study and also taking an academic approach to things, what that did to my levels of cognition, for instance, and what it did for my layers of belief and the judgments that I made. And perhaps, if nothing else, it flattened out a lot of my judgments. It made me less quick to judge. It changed my belief structure, I guess almost entirely. And what I did, well, I guess once I began to embrace this change within myself, I found my layers of sort of, as I said earlier, beliefs and judgment, etc., changed quite radically. And I moved from fairly, I guess, relatively destructive views and negative views of things to far more positive ones, and sometimes at best neutral, but I felt neutral was a positive advance on perhaps some of my previous held beliefs. And I have to say here that by no means was I conservative in my thinking, and I certainly felt that I was a fairly open person until I came to university, where that challenged that whole notion. In fact, my sense of self was challenged, if that makes sense. Anyway, if we move over to the notion of objectivity, essentially we're looking at, I guess, almost an empirical view, a scientific view of things, being able to dispassionately look at something and observe what it is, see something as being factual and naming it as factual. The basic things like being able to, can you count that particular item? Can it be described? Can it be imitated? And that particularly is certainly the scientific method. Basically anything that we do in one place we should be able to replicate in another, imitate that and have similar results. And even though science has a kind of provisional truth, in the sense that that's part of I guess the wonders of science really, that science posits the most plausible answer, I guess the most truthful answer to a particular thing, but as always there's a caveat within science that suggests that should better technology come along, newer types of testing, etc., that new evidence may be found that contradicts previous evidence, and that truth changes. So a particular view of something changes over time, and this has happened in many disciplines as we discover more about them. Now, if you look at slide 4, I've literally kind of divided the two outcomes for each of these views. So if we're looking at objective views on, as I say, I use the word dispassionate views on particular information, we might have things like, and we might use words like measurable, achievable, realistic, time-driven, and it's specific. Whereas if we look at subjective beliefs, subjective information, we are looking at things like beliefs, which are changeable, that shift over time, that may be debunked, may be simply rejected over time, opinions which change according to current information, personal views which obviously are orientated towards your history, your social context, even your family context, socio-economic background, etc. And obviously emotions, which are incredibly changeable and transient, and more general views, which, in other words, the repository of information that we have that we utilise at different times during the day or week. Now, the point of me doing these, particularly these two slides, is to get you to start to think about the fact that you've got to move away, to some extent, from your personal views and beliefs to a much more objective way of looking at information. And part of that journey is to actually begin to embrace an empirical model, actually looking up, weighing evidence, looking at tangible outcomes, I guess. And in terms of the sort of academic world, because we as academics make the attempt to be objective about information, you have a whole raft of opinions and ideas that are available to you. Part of the process of becoming an academic is essentially suspending many of your own beliefs, your own opinions and judgments, etc., and being able to look at, weigh up, and consider and reflect on other people's opinions about the same area, same subject, for instance, and then integrate your own opinion, not necessarily with that person's or with even other people, but actually then coming back to reflect on your own opinion about a particular thing and seeing whether it is plausible. And what you may find, as I did, that many of the views that are put forward are counter to your own. They oppose your own. And I think you very quickly realise, well I did anyway, realise that perhaps you do need to adjust your opinion. And this is quite a shift, I have to add, and quite a difficult one, certainly that I found initially. Now I want to move to the difference between primary and secondary sources. These are two things that you'll hear throughout your studies at different times. In the briefest possible terms, a primary source is an original object or document. So it's the raw material or first-hand information, as I state in slide 6. So items of primary sources include things like historical and legal documents. And in its most basic form, the most basic explanation is that if I write an account, so I'm writing a first-hand account of a particular event, then that is a primary source. I'm a witness to that. It doesn't have to just be text. It could be that I film it. It could be even that I sing it, for instance. But it's a primary source. It's come from the original source and is novel in that sense. Moving over to secondary sources, if you'll have a quick look on slide 7, I've put a fairly succinct summary of what it is. A secondary source is something written about a primary source. So in other words, if I wrote an account of, say, I don't know, for instance, a riot downtown in Burnie, that account, if someone, say a journalist, was to pick my account up and then make some sort of comment or commentary on my statement, that would be a secondary source. So the journalist would become a secondary comment or a secondary source in that sense. He's commenting about a primary source, i.e. me, write my account, and then he writes his own account, so that becomes a secondary source because he's writing about the first source. Fairly straightforward, really. There's several examples I provide in that slide. Depending on what you're studying, you'll primarily be using secondary sources, although as you go further up in your studies, generally you get to then access and use primary sources, particularly, say, if you're doing things like history, for instance. Some of the benefits of using secondary sources is that someone else has actually spent time thinking and reflecting on a primary source and come to some sort of conclusion and made some judgments and statements about that particular thing. You can then integrate that with your work without having to do the legwork. I'm not saying necessarily that's a lazy thing. I think, in fact, from my perspective, it's efficient. But of course, what you'll inevitably have to do is examine those secondary sources fairly closely, because generally there's competing views, competing opinions about things, and you have to take into account those and discern whether they have veracity or not. From slide 9, I begin to discuss the examining sources of information. So where is our information coming from now? Where is it likely to come from in the future? If you have a look on slide 10, I've looked at the transitions of where information will come from over time and the predictions for where that news and other information comes from. At the moment, it comes from comes from television, newspapers, etc., and radio, although already certainly newspapers and magazines are shrinking, both in availability and in popularity. Circulation has gone down for both, which is a concern. A lot of quite well established magazines and newspapers are becoming online only, so there's online versions. Radio has obviously over time lost its place. Still many people listen to the radio, but its popularity has gone down. Television still holds some place, but it has been dwarfed somewhat by the internet, and I have to admit here that my own viewing time, I used to spend perhaps 2 hours a night watching TV. I think I would watch perhaps 4 hours a week if I'm lucky. I consume all of my news and my other content via the internet. I prefer that as a medium. It means I can control what I'm watching, how I watch it, when I watch it, but also, more importantly, I can screen out advertising, which as I may have said in previous lectures, is something that I abhor. My rationale being that if I want to go and buy something, I'll go and buy it. I don't need someone to actually tell me what to go and buy. That seems self-evident, I guess, but for me anyway, television from once, I guess a moderate use, I've now moved to sort of a minimal model. I still like TV when I do watch it, but it's so sparing, it's not funny. Personally, I think that the whole stream of news and other social networks and so on will become the mainstay of how we get our information and news, whether this is via things like Facebook or Twitter or just blogs, etc. But I think that ultimately these things will shift towards an online presence, and that over time, even though they may still exist in, I guess, truncated forms or reduced forms, even radio, for instance, will probably be streamed over the internet. Television obviously already is. You've got things like iPlayer, and I imagine as a platform it's probably far cheaper and perhaps even easier to transmit content, although I can't be sure. But anyway, so slide 10 really is the future, or at least the potential future of how we get news or get access to news and information. Slides 11 through to 14 is certainly the lecture I discussed. If we only had a headline, how could we verify the source of that headline and the information contained within it? And I look at 3 different possible sources and what they might bring in terms of veracity and any sort of verification we can for a piece of information. I won't speak too much about it. I'll let you have a look at it and see what you make of it. If you do, and if you have any questions, by all means email me. If we move to the real content of the lecture, if you have a look at slide 16, I start off by talking about the authoritative sources, so assessment strands. How do we assess something that has any sort of authority, or that we believe, or that we want to establish has some sort of authority? 3 primary things: that the research reported, or the information reported, the wording doesn't matter, has been conducted in an acceptable manner. So say, for instance, if there is research that's been done by an academic, that we can understand the methodology that they used and that it's a method that's acceptable within that discipline. The second thing is the ideas and information contained in the source are situated within the relevant academic literature through the use of in-text citations. So what we want to see is that the information that's being presented should be grounded not only in a particular discipline, but also should be supported by the other academics working in that field. The last one is the source has been reviewed by academics and assessed as suitable for publication. So through a review process, someone trying to present their work, their research, other academics have to actually review that to make sure that it's cogent, that it fits within the discipline, and then is suitable for publication. And this is a serious process in academia. The 5 primary questions you have to ask when you're trying to assess a piece of information, whether you can use it at university and within the context of your assessments, they, for me, are the ground spring of literally doing any of your assessments, because you have to get evidence, you have to literally go out and search for evidence to support your position whilst doing an assessment. In that process of your search, you will come across a lot of information in different forms, and you need to be able to find out and determine whether a source is suitable or reliable. And there's the key word, reliability. Is it reliable? So the questions you need to ask is, where does the information come from? Who is the audience for the information? How is the information verified? Is the source of the information objective? Is the information up to date? So we take the first question, where does the information come from? We would look at something called the authority test. What that would involve is, do we trust the author of the material, and do we trust the publication in which the material actually is published. The second question is, who is the audience for? This is important. This is called the audience test. So is the information for students and academics? Is it for professional people in specific fields? Is it the general public? The differences here, of course, is something that would be published in a newspaper would be very different in both its structure and perhaps its appeal and its focus than, say, something that would be printed in an academic journal, as you will soon discover when you go looking at academic journals. Number 3 is the transparency test, which underpins the question, how is the information verified? In this case, it's about discipline-specific guidelines, the methodology, and methodology simply means is what methods do they use to collect their data. Is the information accurate in terms of its collection? Is it transparent? Can we actually literally look into the methods that a particular researcher used, and can it be checked? If there's no kind of hidden areas where possibly things were fudged or things were omitted, for instance, and can it be checked by others? This is key. Number 4, which is the objectivity test, with which the question is appended, is the source of the information objective? We consider such things as, is there a bias in the way that the information is presented? What was the purpose of the particular study or the research that was done? And also the author. Is the author credible? Do they have a history in this particular area? Have they done research in this area that has been received well in the past? The other thing is, which is a little bit more subtle, is how has the research been funded? Because inevitably all research costs money and someone has to pay that money. And I think most people, I'm hoping out there in listener land, realise that funding, which can come from either the public or private sectors, is weighted to some extent. There's certain expectations around funding. So, for instance, if I'm doing market research on a type of cola, for instance, if I am one of those cola companies, there's going to be certain information that I guess I want to hear, and so the focus will be on that particular desired finding, if you like, and there's some influence on for instance, if there's possibly a product that's available that the company who produces it decides to fund research to actually find out the impact of that particular product, and if it's found to be a negative finding, then perhaps that'll be skewed or changed so as not to cause problems in the marketing of that product. Obviously, commercial companies don't want to lose market share. The last test, which is the currency test, which is underpinned by the question, is the information up to date, is a kind of an interesting one. I have a fairly mixed feeling about this, in the sense that I've used older sources in history, and it's not to suggest that historians writing 100 years ago had a better take than contemporary historians, for instance. However, personally, I found authors of some time ago I guess interesting because of the style of language that they used and the way that they posited certain issues and certain events, which was very different from more contemporary writers. I guess the key thing is, and the overarching thing is the information up to date, which certainly in today's information world or highway, how quickly does information change? And I would argue very quickly. Are the ideas significant in the discipline? In other words, are they part of the linear development of a particular, or the chronology development of a particular subject or discipline area? And do the ideas stand the test of time? And as I've said, I think some do. Like I said, some of the views of historians do cast a shadow of relevance over more contemporary studies. And to give you an example, while I was studying the Black Plague, we were looking at the economics of the plague, and with the loss of the population as it was. And for me, I guess I did more research than I had to do for a particular assignment. And what I was intrigued about was, if the plague was as it was written about, why is it that we had very different reports and different views about how people died? Some people, for instance, who are afflicted with the plague would take several weeks to die. Others could die overnight, which gave rise, for me, to further research into types of plague, for instance, and I discovered that there's two types, or what they think was two types: a pneumonic version and also a bubonic version. And what was intriguing was that the virulence of the actual plague itself struck me as kind of odd, and I guess given the history of humanity, etc., I found it slightly difficult to believe that it could have had the impact that it did in the way that it did and as quick as it did without other factors perhaps being involved. And I soon discovered a rather interesting historian writing some time ago, many decades ago, who put forward the thesis that it wasn't necessarily the plague, although the plague was paramount obviously in many deaths, but his claim was that other illnesses, things like typhus, cholera, scarlet fever, but were, I guess, facilitated or at least exacerbated by malnutrition, for instance, because there'd been, particularly across Europe, there'd been very harsh summers, dry, almost drought-like summers with extremely cold winters, which gave rise to food shortages. These food shortages obviously reduced immune efficiency, and so people were more susceptible to these particular illnesses. Now, at least from my reading in contemporary studies, this view had been disregarded. So these other diseases which had been hovering in the background and obviously must have had an impact on certain levels of the population. For instance, typhus was incredibly virulent at the time. That with the complicating factors of other things involved, created the right conditions for not only bubonic plague but also for these other diseases to come in and literally cut swathes through the population. Anyway, for me that was a sudden realisation that just because something is older does not mean necessarily that it's out of date and that it has no use, or in short, that it's redundant. However, I guess in our current context I have to suggest that you look at the most contemporary research in any particular area. If you have the time, go back like I did. That was one of my guilty pleasures, always looking beyond the material that I was given. Got me in trouble a few times in terms of my reduced time to actually complete an assignment because I was reading too many ancillary opinions, articles, etc. on a particular subject, but that's another story. Anyway, if we manage to actually measure, and this is what I'm suggesting you do with all the bits of information you see from here on, use the measure that I've just given you, these 5 tests, the reliability tests, to ascertain whether information is actually reliable and true. You still have to consider, like I've put in slide 24, the fact that truth is often hard to define. Like I said, extremely difficult. If information does pass the reliability test, then of course it is reliable. However, different conclusions can be drawn from the same material. So whilst we may be attracted to the same information and even use the same information, the outcome, our interpretation of that and our conclusions could be very different. And that's something to bear in mind when you're actually looking at people's assessment and use of certain types of information. Slide 25 is simply a recap on what those are, the questions, and like I said, I want to cement these here. This will be a mantra in this unit, for want of a better word. You have to use these to assess information. Slide 26 is simply an overview of the review process that academic work goes through for publication. I'll let you read through that. I won't tarry too much. I guess it suffices to say that in academia, all work, certainly that's published by universities, etc., go through a fairly rigorous process of review before they're even considered for publication. This review is simply to ensure that the methods used, the language used, etc., is not only accurate but as truthful as it can be, and obviously as objective as it can be. For distance students, if you can, I'd like you at least to consider an attempt, activity 1 and 2. 2 is probably a little bit more difficult in terms of how you might do that, but it'll be interesting to see if you could find someone to perhaps have a look at your work as a secondary source. If not, like I said, certainly attempt activity 1, the materials on Milo. There's a whole range of other resources that I've put on Milo. If you can, it would be good if you could work through. These will help you to gain a broader understanding about the potential of information and evaluating information in this sense. And more importantly, get you to be actually going through the process of doing these things, so they become, and they're done by rote, if you like. What I implore you to do is begin to consider looking at the assessment. even if it's if nothing else, because you're doing an example of academic and non-academic writing, that you do some background reading about that particular thing. I've put some material up to actually show the comparison, to show the differences. Personally, I think you should look beyond just the material I've put up and to start to consider this seriously, because you're going to be writing about it in your first assessment. And the more information that you have, the more knowledge you have about this, hopefully the better you'll write about it. Anyway, I'll say no more. Have a great week. All the best, Mike.